go. Hello. Hello, Elizabeth. Okay, I think we are good to go. Um, Hello, as you know, Elizabeth, you're the only person here. So my name is Julian Thompson, and I'm an adoptee. Um, and this is the first of three webinars. The first one, I wanted to focus on birth parents because I thought yes, Elizabeth, that is correct. So I don't know how much of that you heard. I think we're all suffering with the consequences of coronavirus, which is impacting on people's lives, especially their online lives, as everybody goes online. And as everybody goes online, all the servers crash. But here we are, and we've managed to make this work. So to go back to what I was talking about, the reason I decided to talk about birth parents first was because before we can understand adoptees, before we can understand adoptive parents, we first of all have to understand the heritage from where it all began. And I'm aware as well that everybody has different stories. Everybody comes to the adoption narrative in a very different way. I am trying to come at it from many, many different angles. I'm not particularly precious about theories or about ways of understanding this. I'm just, my job here is to help us to explore these issues and to help us deepen our understanding of these issues. By the way, I only have some notes here. I'm not following them ad verbatim. So please, Elizabeth, do feel free to interrupt me as and when this is a lot smaller than I'd hoped. But it's where we are. I chose to speak about this particular topic because the voice of birth parents is so often lost throughout the adoption experience. However, I did find a voice, and I wanted to tell you about Jill. Now, Jill tells us that she gave her son up for adoption in 1967, when practices were very different from today. Her son hadn't been neglected or abused. Her only sin was to be a 17-year-old single mother. There was no support for her, and she had no choice in the matter. She grieved for him all through the missing years until he contacted her when he was 27 years old. So the first thing I think to think about is that Jill is telling us here that things were very different when she was 17 years old. She is telling us about a time when things for her were very, very difficult. It was a difficult time for her to keep her child. It was a difficult time for her to be pregnant and unmarried. She was also 17 and incredibly young. I'm presuming that Jill faced a lot of disgrace and she faced alienation from her community. Jill also tells us that her son had not been neglected or abused. I believe that through the passage of time, our cultural perceptions and expectations of adoption have changed. I think over time we have moved from where adoption was seen as a way of helping to alleviate the burden, and I use that word with caution, of of having a child who was born into a family that was unwed and a family that was not, it was a way to deal with it, with what society then perceived as a problem. This leads me to ask if the system which we have built, which was originally intended to protect birth mothers from the humiliation of being a single mother, is still fit for purpose. Because our intentions back in 1967 are very different from the intentions that we have today. Adoption today is used to deal with the problem of parents who cannot look after their children, or for whatever reason. Back in 1967, it was to deal with the problem of parents, of society not wanting adults or parents to look after their children in what they perceived to be was the right structure. So, as I've said, many birth parents today are losing their rights through the adoption process because of drug, alcohol abuse, neglect, or physical, mental, or sexual abuse, which is different from previous trends because children were not at risk of any real harm in 1967 from being born into a single mother family, whereas today the landscape is very different and children are at risk. So in a sense, this idea of risk or perceived risk only serves to reinforce that sense of shame. And Elizabeth, you were right, and I think adoption was used to alleviate shame. Of course, we must do everything within our power to safeguard and protect children. I am not disputing that. But my question is, does adoption only alleviate the problem it was originally intended to solve? Perhaps, but I think we need to go deeper than that, and I think we need to consider some other things before I answer that question. Of course, again, our primary concern should always be for the welfare of our children. Obviously, children should not be put at risk unnecessarily. But the science of trauma, the science of ACEs, and also the science of adoption and attachment are asking us to be curious about this question. And that question is the removal of a child from its parents, if they are at risk of being harmed, a short-sighted solution that distracts us from a wider view of the social and family problems facing birth parents? Indeed, I think the journey that we are taking as a society and how we understand drug and alcohol abuse as a response to trauma is helping us to develop more compassion towards these issues, and it also encourages us to view them through a public health lens rather than a social problem lens. Elizabeth, I'm just reading your comment now. I absolutely agree with you, and that will be my next point. Elizabeth, you should do this webinar for me. As I was researching what I was going to say in this webinar, I wanted to talk about, I wanted to add some other voices to the conversation. So I was reading a book by Dr. Gabor Mate called When the Body Says No. Dr. Gabor Mate explains in his book that those he worked with in Vancouver, that the deepest pain that all of these parents had about their children that they abandoned or who were taken from them, that was the deepest pain that they had. Without exception, every one of those parents was abused or abandoned in childhood. So I'll say that again. So concerning those that Dr. Gabor Mate worked with in Vancouver, who were drug addicts and who lived with HIV, the deepest pain they all have is about the children that they have abandoned or who have been taken from them. Without exception, they were abused or abandoned in childhood. So then my question from above, and to remind you what that question was, is the removal of a child from its parents, if they are at risk of being harmed, a short-sighted solution that distracts us from a wider view of problems facing birth parents? I still don't think that's an easy question to answer, but I'm going to attempt to do so. And I think the answer is twofold. I think that adoption has historically been a short-sighted answer. Practice and knowledge and the way that we implement those are constantly changing. And I don't think it would be fair to make a comparison between 1967 and Jill's story and today. The second part of the answer to that question is that adoption doesn't necessarily concern itself with the future of the child or the capacity for parents to change their circumstances. Therefore, we need to find creative ways to think about how we care for our children. And moreover, how we care for our children in the event that our parents or those parents are unable to do so. We need to think about ways that we are not causing permanent disruption and severance of attachment, because I think that in itself is an exceptionally damaging thing for a child. And I think that my answer to that question is that things need to change, and the reason that things need to change is because what we understand about adoption today and what we understand about connection, what we understand about attachment has changed. And with that change becomes the inevitable truth that what we are doing isn't necessarily working. So the next part, and because I'm aware that I am jumping a little bit about, and with coronavirus it's just everything's been a bit crazy, so thank you everyone, Elizabeth, for staying with me and for really engaging. I'm going to read your last comment. So the lack of support for birth parents that causes the need for adoption. I totally agree, and I think that in Scotland anyway, and I can only really talk about the Scottish context, is that we are starting to, with the introduction of the care review, we're starting to move away from seeing adoption as a one-size-fits-all, but we're starting to look at what support do families need to ensure that where possible children can stay in the family home. The problem is that's expensive, and I wonder how we're going to do that. But that is the conversations for the politicians to have. So the second thing that I wanted to touch, and I touched tentatively because I am not quite sure to what extent this has been explored, but I'm opening up the can of worms anyway because I think we need to. And the next thing I'm going to talk about is reunions. And I thought, with what is going on with coronavirus right now, I thought it would be useful to explore the different ways that we connect with one another. With coronavirus, we're all being asked to isolate, but then we're also being asked to connect, and which serves as a really interesting juxtaposition of one another. But it also got me asking the question of how we connect, and the modern definition of connection has very much changed with how we connect with each other on the internet. And the reason I said open the can of worms, Elizabeth, was because I think that it is a subject that could open a lot of debate, a lot of conversation, a lot of feelings and emotions. And I think the phrase opening a can of worms is probably one that we can all relate to. In many ways, we are told to stuff our feelings down, not talk, not say anything. where our sense of emotions, are the way that we relate to our emotions is seen as inconvenient for people. So by opening the can of worms, what I'm really trying to say is bringing out the way we feel about these issues into the open. And I hope that that we can do that. We don't have time tonight, I think, to really get to the bottom of the can, as it were. But I think we can start to explore some of these trickier, nuanced issues. So the advent of social media forces us to look more deeply at reunions and how these can impact everyone involved in the adoption process. I have heard stories of reunions happening over Facebook. I have heard that we need to be having, that somehow that needs to be managed, and I'm cautious about using that language, but I think we need to look at the pros and the cons of social media. So, 3 problems that I've identified with social media are the ease in which everyone can contact one another, so therefore privacy has been lost as a result of social media, or privacy as we once knew it has been lost. The lack of therapeutic management involved in such a reunion over social media, and the potential for re-traumatising the adoptee and birth parents. You may not be ready to meet your birth children, and with the ease of social media, you can. Or you can at least meet them, but not be ready to. So I think there's a real balancing act to be had here, because on the one hand, there may be false expectations on adoptees who wish to meet birth parents, and birth parents who may not be either ready for that or want that. And I think we struggle as a society to understand why a birth parent might not want that. Why would a birth parent not want to speak to their child? And then we've got the child going, well, why does the birth parent not want to speak to me? Why do they not want to have anything to do with me? And so that's the disconnect that I think we face, is that we have these differing expectations, and in that scenario nobody is getting their needs met. So I'm really curious as to how we can utilise social media to better manage reunions. However, without being so doom and gloom, social media does offer us the opportunity to connect in a more creative way and to connect in a more imaginative way when it comes to reunions. There's an opportunity for both parties to manage contact to suit their own needs and own levels of comfort, assuming they both want reunions to happen. There's the ability to text, message and Skype prior to meeting in real life. And I think as a society, collectively, we need to embrace the opportunities that social media presents. If we can do that, we can better manage the process and ensure that it is safe for everyone. I agree with you, Elizabeth, and that forced contact, it comes from both sides, because it could be that the birth parent wants to have contact and the adoptee doesn't, but it could also be the adoptee wants to have contact but the birth parent doesn't. So there's a really interesting dynamic there, and I think if we embrace social media as a tool that is fundamentally for good, even though it can feel sometimes it's not, then we can really grapple with these issues and fundamentally help other people to better meet their needs. So today has inevitably, changed everything that that I was going to talk about. But the last thing that I wanted to talk about was to step away from birth parents and move to birth family and widen the scope. And I wanted to offer a story, if you will, from lived experience This is my own lived experience. And I'm taking quite a big risk here, and I'm not quite, I've never shared personal things through this, so I'm really interested, I'm curious to see how this goes. So when I, as I said earlier, was adopted. I was adopted when I was 7, and prior to my adoption and being put into care, I had 2 older brothers, and those 2 older brothers were taken into care because my mother was unable to look after her children. So the wee play with words here is How I Met My Brother, which is a play on the TV programme How I Met Your Mother. So I'm hoping you're getting the joke there, Elizabeth. So I met my brother when I was 19 years old, and we met through Facebook. Now, the bizarre thing about it is that I remember seeing his picture on Facebook and thinking, oh my goodness, he looks like me. And so that was the first shock. The shock of having your heritage and your identity reflected back to you in a way that you didn't really manage. You know, it was I looked him up on Facebook on a whim. I didn't really expect to find anything. So when that happened, I was very shocked. But the great thing about this is the fact that what was to happen was to be one of the most bittersweet experiences of my life. We took it upon ourselves to manage our contact with each other. We spoke a lot over Facebook. We waited until one another were ready to go on to Skype, and it wasn't until several months later that we agreed to meet. And I think that if there is anything to be said about reunions, it is about the fact it is about being able to manage it and feel safe, and that both parties feel in control. Now, that's not to say that my reunion with my brother was not to be without difficulties, and I think I romanticised the idea quite a bit. And it worked. Unfortunately, my brother was to pass away in 2015, and that was difficult. But what it has given me is the ability to talk about my experience and hopefully use that experience to help other people realise that it's not scary. Well, it is scary, but it's not terrifying, and it needn't be terrifying. Everybody needs to find their own level of comfort. And if we can consider... So my real point here is that had I known my brother's history, I maybe would have acted differently, and I would have done things very differently. So they definitely do have to be taken step by step, and they also have to, each step has to be taken with a renewed understanding of the other. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Thank you. It is what it is. And it's very sad, and there is, that I still grieve, and I need to own that part of me, and I need to heal. Still, but I don't think that will ever heal. But going back to your point there that you made about knowledge and our ability to understand others helps us to think about how we better respond to other people to help us meet their needs when they're maybe not able to do so themselves. And in the reunion process, I really think that's important. I think had I known that my brother was an alcoholic, my approach would have been very different. If I understood what it meant to be an alcoholic, I would have been able to respond differently. If I understood more about myself, I would have been able to respond very differently. And I'm not saying what I did was wrong. I did the best I could with the information that I had. And I think that's really the spirit of what I am trying to say today. is that no matter where any of us are on that journey, whether it's reunion, whether it's deciding that, whether it's looking at different ways of trying to negotiate these different feelings and thoughts and things, the important thing is to remember that every single one of us is just doing our best at the time and place that we are. And Elizabeth, I'm just reading your I'm reading your message again. Mutual respect and empathy for each party in the reunion process is so necessary. I'd be interested to know, Elizabeth, do you think that do you think that that reunion process needs an intervention from a third party? Exactly. Elizabeth, I think you're right. People do need to know what it all entails before starting, and I think with the emotional power that sits behind a lot of this, it can be very difficult to navigate the morass of information that's out there, but also separate the wood from the trees. I bought one of the books you told me about. Okay. I'm just noticing there's a slight delay, I think, on the webinar. So yes, talking about yes, and I guess with my brother, there was issues around what could have been, and I think that was probably the biggest issue that I had, or the biggest question I had was what could have been in a very different world. And I think the loss of those expectations, the fantasy, the loss of the fantasy is perhaps harder than the reality. So I think it is about managing our own expectations through the reunion process, which isn't easy, but I think it's possible. Yeah, you're right, and I think it's not the loss so much of what is or what was is the loss of what could have been. And I think I figured I struggled to get my head around that because it was, well, if it didn't happen, if it wasn't real, then how, and if it hadn't happened yet, how can I lose something that I never had? And I realised that I need to go back and read The Power of Now and remind myself to stay present. So I was responding, Elizabeth, to you were saying the pervasive sense of loss that stays with us all, and the loss of what could have been. And I was responding to that to saying the thing that I struggled with was the impact of losing something that I never had. I agree. And I think adoptive parents struggle with the loss of potentially being unable to have their own children. The adoptee struggles with the loss of a life that they could have had, and the birth parents struggle with the life with a child that they could have kept, or may have kept, or maybe have the chance to keep. and adoptive mourn never growing up, and adoptive parents mourn their own inability to have children. Regarding your adoptees mourn over. Yes, exactly. So I think a lot of healing is about coming to terms with the you use the word mourn there, and it's coming to terms with that loss. It's coming to terms with loss as a we don't like talking about loss as a society, and I think British people are fundamentally very bad at talking about grief or death. But I think we need to, if we want to understand adoption, we need to understand death, because in many ways, an old life has died, and a new one has started. So Elizabeth, you've said even if growing up in an adoptive family is actually the best thing for that child, we all still mourn what could have been, and that was not our experience. That's very true, and I think because it goes against the natural order of things, doesn't it? And I think anything that goes against the natural order of things often feels difficult. If we look at, and I'm using a very different example, but if we look at climate change goes against, the way that we're polluting the environment goes against the natural order of things. So when humans go against the natural order of things, I think we create trauma. And not necessarily intending to do that, but nonetheless doing that anyway. And sometimes if we can make those decisions from a place of love, a place of compassion, I think that better places us to make good decisions. And the descendants of British people have difficulty with feelings. Absolutely. I feel bad for having feelings quite a lot of the time. I feel like having feelings is something of a privilege, and that's something I work hard to overcome. But my experience of Canadians and Americans is very much, and obviously working with Suzanne, has very much been, that America and Canada seem to have a much better understanding of feelings and emotions, and almost like the new world has got a better way of understanding our feelings and coping and processing those. I've just read your I've just read your comment. North Americans are just a little further away from the stage culture. I'm interested of you in your use of the word "stayed." But it still pervades our consciousness way more than is healthy. Elizabeth, you're making me laugh because I think you know. So I have never been to America or Canada, but I have been to Australia and I've been to New Zealand, and it's very different. Everything is so liberal and so free, and so people just don't have the same worries that we have over in the UK. We don't have that sense of rigidness. So Elizabeth, I hope that this has been helpful. Yes, we are all still colonies. Yes, we are all under the thumb of Her Majesty. Even though we don't want to be, especially here in Scotland. So yes, Elizabeth, I hope that yes, we do live within a colonised mindset. That sort of idea that we have to give our power away, and the idea that we have to be subservient. I hope it's been helpful, Elizabeth. I certainly don't claim any any superior knowledge on any of this. I completely understand why you wouldn't want to talk about your experience, and you know that is up to everyone else. I had said at the beginning of my journey of doing these webinars. Oh, I'm glad that I've inspired you to share. I had said to myself that at the beginning of these webinars that I wouldn't talk about my own personal experience. Something changes though, that I'm asking people to be vulnerable and to share and to come in on a journey with me, and I realised I couldn't do that effectively without sharing a part of me. So I had to change. And I realised there was a fear within me of being vulnerable. I thought, no, Julie, that's just an excuse for you to not be vulnerable. I was also wondering, Elizabeth, if you wouldn't mind, if you would be able to share on Twitter just a little bit about what you've experienced tonight, a little bit maybe about the technical issues we've been having and how we overcame those, just so to offer people hope that and to sort of understand if this would be something that would be worth doing again. I think you're right. I think different perspectives matter, and that's why I had the idea of doing the 3 webinars: was the birth parents, the adoptee, and the adoptive parents. Yes, I can imagine. I can imagine the judgmental look that you would get, and oh my goodness, you did what to your child? But then people assume if you've been adopted or you're in care that somehow you were bad, or you know, or somehow your your life is predetermined for you, and you're not going to do well. Yes, I agree. I absolutely agree that these events should be hosted on Zoom, and I think that's really valuable feedback. And I'm hoping as we work through the coronavirus that things will get easier. So, Elizabeth, is there anything else that you think would be useful for another webinar? Or for something to add to what I've already talked about? Because I have only shared a very limited perspective today. So it'd be really interesting to find out what you think, or what you would like to hear more about. Yes, but people who adopted are judged, and it's almost like, oh, well, but you have a nice family now, though, yeah? And it's like, it's almost like the adoption experience makes you a better person somehow, or if you've been in care, they're somehow a worse person. So it's mixed, and it just shows the level of confusion that people have around people who come from different life backgrounds. Okay, Elizabeth, can you tell me what you mean by more discussion? Do you think that do you think that the discussion should be throughout the webinar, or do you think there should be a time at the end for a Q&A? What's your thoughts about that? Absolutely. There's a lot of there's a lot of things that I could have said, um, that I didn't say, um, and I think with the technical issues we were having as well. Yes. Okay. Well, I think for me, that was really all I had to say. It'd be really interesting to start a conversation on Twitter. I with everything that's been going on with coronavirus, just to give you an idea. I haven't been engaging with Twitter in the adoption world as so much as trying to help out in the local community. Um, so I think I will be starting to engage a little bit more on Twitter in the next wee while. But for now, I think I should get going and I think that's really helpful feedback, Elizabeth. I think that's really useful, and I will certainly. I think that's a lovely structure because I think that's a much more I can't speak participatory way of doing it.